ancestors explored the wonders of nature. This is a theme that I've seen around a little bit lately, so I wanted to give my own opinion on it. And the thing that struck me was usually when I think of, at least, all of these themes that involve ancestors, there's this tendency to think way back, far back ancestors, the tribes and pre-settled communities that moved around, the hunter-gatherers, the ones who were the first herbalists and had nature deities and nature veneration. These are the things that come to mind first, I think, for a lot of us. But I started to think about, well, what about the more recent ancestors? What about the ancestors from just a few generations ago? How did all of them interact with nature? It's easy for us to think of the ancient humans as interacting with nature because they had to on a day-to-day basis much more than we do. But what about everyone else? That's going to be our theme today. Welcome everyone, merry meet, I'm Witch Hazel, and today we're going to delve into this theme, but for anyone new to the channel, I like to present information on how I try to mesh together the practical kind of hands-on side of witchcraft with the more spiritual side of things, the more usually difficult to pin down spiritual side of things. Also, for anyone who is new or not new, I have a brand new free offer for everyone in the description. I want to mention that now because I don't think I will mention it later on in the video, but that is a 4-step guide to enhancing your intuitive power, and it is meant to help you deepen your connection with divine and start seeing more consistent manifesting and spell work success within 30 days or so. So if that's of interest, please do check the description. But now on to our theme for today, which is our ancestors and nature. So first off, if we think of those far back ancestors who were more hunter-gatherer type of communities, there was a lot of interaction with nature just by default. It was a lot more day-to-day and survival-based. For that reason, though, even though we like to think of these communities as very much venerating nature and being appreciative of nature, I sometimes wonder if there was as much of that as we think there was. I'm not saying there wasn't, because I do believe that this was true. Otherwise, these communities would not have had nature spirits and nature deities. So there was an aspect of understanding that nature was very powerful and giving respect to that. There was also, I believe, this side of appreciation to the beauty of nature. I think that would be natural as well, just given that this is what surrounds us all the time, or this is what surrounded our ancestors, was nature and the beauty of nature. And especially when you are brought up in a community that understands both nature provides for us and nature can be deadly, there is a certain amount of awe in that. There's a certain amount of both respect and appreciation for that. So I do believe that our farthest back ancestors probably had the easiest time experiencing the wonders of nature because they lived through them. But then let's take a look at what might have happened. This is just my train of thought, mind you. What might have happened then when we go further into human evolution and we start to see settled communities and farming, that sort of thing. I think in that case, our ancestors probably had many similar observations of nature from the ones who came before, but actually this may have been an improvement because now there was more, I want to say more time to admire nature or to be part of nature in something that was not a designated task, like we have to move from A to B to get to whatever food that we want, or before this season, that sort of thing. I think that little bit of that stress was taken off to a degree. The first farmers certainly didn't have it easy, but when we take off that idea of being distracted by just survival and we put it into, okay, now we are a settled community, so in theory we have a more stable sense of our survival, I could see those ancestors as creating now more of a intricate way of interacting with nature. Maybe they had more time to look at the different plants and animals around them, to research them, to learn about them. You know, the first herbalists now could experiment more because they weren't on the move for as much time. So I think that group of ancestors still had many of the same ways of interacting with nature. They just maybe were able to do it in a more cognizant way. Where I think things really must have taken a shift, in my mind, is when we get closer to larger urban centers and industrialization. So during this time, the biggest changes would be, for one thing, much more concentration of population in more urban centers. And this would have the negative effect of being taken away from nature to some degree. There just wasn't as much space between people in these urban centers. So I think from that aspect, the people living in those centers may have started to disconnect to some degree from nature and would have had to put more effort into observing and appreciating nature. Not so much for the folks that were still rural. They still had all of the same connections that the previous ancestors did. But this is the time frame where I see problems arising as we, as a species, start to disconnect from nature, and less interaction because of it. And this, I think, would have continued on through modern times. I'm going to pause my thought process here in Victorian times, actually, because around the 18th, 19th century, especially 19th century, you have the rise of factories. And now we go from just a disconnect with nature to an actual destruction of nature. The early factories were spewing all sorts of refuse and remnants into nature. They were poisoning the rivers and creating air pollution and all of those things. So we have now compounded problems with trying to appreciate nature. Because on the one hand, everybody needs a job at this point, and the jobs are in the factories, but the factories are destroying nature. So I think it's interesting to observe that there was, at this time, what I'm going to call in another video, I don't know when I'm going to post these videos, but I will mention the rise of the naturalist. This was a very big thing in Victorian times. Victorian pertains to Great Britain and the Empire mostly, but that general era of history throughout, and again, I'm thinking of Western Europe because that's my background. That's what I tend to think of most. So during this time, we have realized that there's a disconnect between us and nature. We have realized that, to some degree, we have realized that we are starting to destroy nature. So there were people at this point in time saying, hey, you know, living in the city, we're all getting sick, this is depressing, can't see the sun half the time. We want to get back to our roots. We want to get back to nature. So it became popular then to go out to the countryside if you want some fresh air. Go out to, again, the countryside and start to collect things, flora, fauna, catalog things, keep a journal for naturalist observations. learn how to paint and draw and sketch everything you see in the natural world. I think this became the nature veneration of that era, of the 19th century, more or less. But the funny thing is that it still was not really connected. So now we are actively trying to get back out into nature. We are actively trying to appreciate nature through collecting things, through drawing things, through creating art that resembles or is inspired by nature, we are learning about nature through scientific experimentation and through record keeping. So this kind of exploration became our interaction with nature, but the interesting thing about it is that we didn't really connect very well with nature through doing this, because it's all still keeping us separated from nature. Although I think, all things considered, it was a step in the right direction. So then let's fast forward again a little bit and talk about more modern generations. So we went from being completely immersed in nature to being completely separated from nature during most of our industrial and scientific revolutions. Also, to encouraging more appreciation for man-made beauty rather than natural beauty. And I think at some point along the way, we continued to learn and understand that we are not helping out the earth very much. We're not doing great things for our earth, and we are still causing ourselves more harm by pollution and by being disconnected to nature. So here I want to get into our very recent ancestors, maybe the last 2-3 generations. And I'm thinking of like my parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents. And I have a particularly lucky background for this theme, because my family is German and Austrian. And in Germanic areas, it is very popular to go out into nature, to go wandern, right? It's the thing, it's what they all do. When my dad talks about his childhood, it's always they went out to the mountain, they went out to the fields, the kids ran amok and just, collected flowers and things. Also, on the Germanic side of things, this was not my father's side of the family, but my mother's side of the family was very big into outdoor sports, especially wintertime sports. And I know this is still very common for many German people. You go out, you do sports, you go hiking, you go running, you go mountain biking, skiing. All of these things are done, when compared to other nations, almost to an extreme with the German-speaking nations. So I think this is a good sign. I think this is kind of our way of getting back in touch with nature. We started in the Victorian era with understanding that there is a disconnect and we need to get back. And then in more recent, so the tail end of Victorian up through modern times, there has been actual active effort to reconnect to nature in the form of things like going out into nature more, and not so much collecting anymore, but still cataloging, drawing, and learning about the things that we see, appreciating those things. We have cameras now, we take pictures, we post those pictures everywhere, and we take note of why these things caught our eye. Why was this flower so beautiful? Oh, why was that cloud formation so interesting? Let me think on that. And by thinking on those things, then we develop a greater, deeper appreciation for nature and its beauty. So I think we are in the right direction. When you add on top of that things like a renewed interest in nature-based religion or natural spirituality, now we're coming kind of full circle to this understanding of the human being as being part of nature, and not necessarily an equal part. Nature is the greater thing with the greater power. and finding ways to, again, show respect for that in whatever way we do. If it's a ritual, if it's becoming a part of a conservation movement, if it is just spending more time out in nature and offering some sort of biodegradable offer to nature, those are some very good ways to reconnect. Anyway, I'm not sure if I made such a great point here with how our ancestors interacted with nature, but what I wanted to get across was that I think how our ancestors explored nature has varied over time, and that variance has a lot to do with whatever the modern society was at that time and whatever the modern human focus was at that time. So I don't think that the ways we explore nature and interact with nature have necessarily changed over time, but our priorities have. So that's why it seems so different, so vastly different when we look at our hunter-gatherer ancestors versus our farming ancestors versus industrial age ancestors. We think of ourselves as very different, but actually all of the options have been the same. The thing that changes is our scenario, our situation. Let me know if you agree or disagree. Would you say that we really truly do explore the world in a different way now than we did then? Or do you think there are commonalities? Let me know in the description. I'm interested in hearing all of your comments. And I will be back shortly with another video, so I hope you join me for that, and thank you for joining me in this one as well. Until the next time, everyone, blessed be.